When we say Shakespeare tragedy is that we know something bad is going to happen, but there's no way to stop it. It's both sides being motivated. Manipulated is the wrong word. Motivated by nationalism, populism, by some extreme ideas, and both sides has the same type of top leader.
I'm Brian Mose, a farmer living in Florence, South Dakota, and you're listening to the Vance Crowe podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today we talked with Dr. Zheng Wang, who was my professor in graduate school. He's one of those people that I encountered and I had no idea how big of an impact he would have on my life. But after taking his Introduction to Negotiations class, I realized this is the type of skill that if you can hone it, you can actually change the world. And so I spent hours and hours with Dr. Wang. We became very close. We had many lunches together. We would edit articles together. We even worked on a book. Well, he wrote a book and I gave him a lot of feedback on it. Over the years, it gave me an opportunity to elevate my education far beyond just what my graduate degree was. I was able to have somebody that I could bounce ideas off of, somebody that saw the world in a slightly different way than I did, and somebody that was always open to asking, what do you think about this, and can you think harder about it? So we're going to get to that interview in just a second. I'm really excited about it. But during the interview, you'll hear us mention the Articulate Ventures Network. This is a place I set up for people that wanted to support the podcast and people that want to be meeting other people that listen to the podcast or maybe getting some classes on how to become a tangibly better communicator. If you're interested in joining this group, just know that you can join and immediately start doing things like the book club or virtual reality experiences that we're trying out. All of this is an experiment to figure out how can we create a space where people can come, practice, get new ideas, and become the type of communicator that allows them to express their full humanity, whether that's in the professional context or all the way out into just having better conversations with the people around you. So if you're interested, join the Articulate Ventures Network, link below. And now let's get to the interview with Dr. Zheng Wang. Director, Professor of the Center for Peace Studies at the Seton University School of Diplomacy, Dr. Zheng Wang, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to join you. Really.
So this is a great reunion because you were my mentor and teacher in graduate school, somebody that had a profound impact on the way that I understood how people interacted with one another, how they shared information, how they cooperated, and what happens when it breaks down. And so we could talk about anything going on in the world, but you actually have a very specialized knowledge, not just of negotiations and conflict, but also with U.S.-China relations. And we were having a conversation before we got started about the difference between the perception of masks in the U.S. and China. And I thought that this would be a very interesting place because I think most Americans imagine that the Chinese wear masks because they live in a dictatorship that tells them they have to and that they're very compliant. And so they see that and they think, well, we want the opposite of that. What's your take on this?
Okay, first, I'm very happy to join you. And it's nothing is happier than that to join a former student and saying you are doing very well. And to some extent, I think now we are kind of like colleagues. Because we work on something very similar. We are both of our work is trying to helping other people to be better understood, right? So, like you mentioned, a big part of my job is to help the people in the U.S. and China better understand each other. So the face mask is a very interesting question. Once, do you mind if I ask you, so do you wear face mask regularly recently, or when, if you do so, when was your first time to wear face mask during the coronavirus?
I am deeply resistant to wearing the face mask because, you know, I believe that you see so much of people's emotional reactions by their faces. Mm-hmm. So I have avoided going to all places where I don't have to go. And then if I'm in a place where there's somebody that asks me, like they own a business, I wear one. So probably 3 times in the last 4 months. But I'd never leave my house. I'm almost always here or meeting people outdoors.
Okay. Yeah, but uh, do you agree that face masks, or from your reading, from the information you get, that wearing face mask is really actually helpful and has been effective, especially if we talk about some of the East Asian countries, they are doing better if we're trying to compare than people in the US, European countries. One of the reasons maybe is because wearing face masks. It's most people wearing face masks.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are. And I find myself thinking, on the one hand, I really want to wear a mask. If I thought that it was healthier, I want my people that are around my wife who's pregnant to wear one. But I have this like deep-seated feeling that I'm doing something wrong if I submit to wearing a mask. It feels like it's going against some principle of liberty that's very important to me.
Yeah, so I think that is, I trying to understand this very special phenomena. Because actually many of my Chinese friends, family members, one of the questions they keep asking me is that they cannot understand why people in the US, so many of them don't wear face masks, even though the situation is already got quite bad. I think culture play quite important role. And also another important thing, like when we talk about cultural misunderstanding, is that people always get used to, if they're trying to end something new, something, it's never happened before, if they're trying to understand it, they need a reference. And for the Chinese people, for the Taiwanese, Korean people, it's much easier for them to, when the coronavirus broke out, it's much easier for them to make reference. Because all the Chinese people, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, Japan, they suffered SARS in 2003. That was even worse than coronavirus. So they had a memory about that, and they remembering about the damage. And also at that time, the people got used to wearing face mask. And for the Korean people, their reference is MERS. It's coming from Middle East in 2015. So I think that's probably one of the reasons, because they have this reference. But for the people in the US, in the European countries, they don't have this kind of reference, easy reference. So for them, the reference is flu. So every year, every winter, so many people get caught by flu. But it's normally you just get bad, after a couple of weeks or even shorter. So people not really take it very serious. And also, I think if we talk about face mask, one of the very important reasons is that people here, just like you mentioned, if you're wearing a face mask, you somehow saying, I'm sick, right? I'm not doing well, I got problem. But so that is make a little bit difficult for healthy people to wear a face mask. But a face mask is very widely used in East Asian countries. Sometimes if you go to Japan, for example, you will say, even in the normal time, there's no any, disease or not the flu season. Most people, or majority people, wearing face masks. They wearing face masks for multiple purposes, and they get used to that. So that is also another example that culture play quite important role. Yeah.
Well, and I think that like the concept of Americans looking at the Chinese or Asian cultures and saying they're wearing masks almost reinforces the liberty concept that I'm talking about, because the American perception of Asian behavior, or the behavior of many people living in a place like China, is that they don't have choices. They just do what they have to do. And so like people look at that, and I think they internalize it as, well, I don't want to be in a position where I am told what I have to do. So it's like almost reinforces that divide by seeing Asian countries use masks a lot.
Yeah, I heard about a lot of this kind of discussion, and it's true. You look at that, one of the reasons may be that the East Asian countries, they are doing better in terms of fighting with coronavirus, is that they have a strong government. or the government, like in China, they can force people to do a lot of things, which is difficult to imagine for people here in this country. So the government indeed have some very strong measures, which people here, most of them will consider this is a violation of human rights. But during the pandemic, this kind of interventions might be also effective. But we have to, I think, what I'm trying to explain to many of my colleagues is that even you have a powerful authoritarian government, it's not possible. We cannot just exaggerate the power of this type of government. Still, the people are willing to following the instructions. This part is actually coming from culture. The Confucian culture is actually played quite an important role because one of the key feature of the Confucian culture is collectivism. We talked about collectivism when we were in the school. And so in the collectivism culture, people are more kind of like a group. They trying to be a good member of a group. And they're more willing to sometimes even sacrifice a little bit of their own rights or privilege of freedom to trying to work as a team member. So that kind of Confucian culture, collectivism culture is actually, you can say, in Japan, Korea, Singapore, people they are different types of government. So it's not just because of the government. It's also one of the important reasons is actually this common culture they sharing. People, the community members are more willing to follow in the instructions. And another reason I think I probably need to mention is that in the Confucian culture and the collectivism culture, people are more kind of like respect the opinions from professionals. So you can say it's very interesting during this pandemic that in China, the couple of people became very famous in China are actually all doctors. So they became kind of like, somehow it's like, people respect them. So it's like they following all the instructions the doctors told them to do. And here people normally, I think they don't have this kind of, even though people normally also respecting professionals, but they don't think that they have to following all the instructions a doctor telling them. So that's probably is also another, reason,
Well, my impression of China is that if I were there and I decided I wanted to put a YouTube video up that said I don't wear a mask, that would be treated very harshly, that the ideas that you would be surrounded with in your day-to-day culture, what you read in the newspaper, what you see on YouTube, what's just in the general news, would give you no other expert opinion other than what the doctor says. Is that an accurate representation? Do they have counter ideas in China?
Yeah, I know that many people think about this way, especially, China has a very different types of government and different politics. But we have to think this way. China is also currently, there's no much difference. People are also not get most of their information from social media, rather than from the official media or newspaper. Most of the young people, they never really read the hard copy of newspaper or printed by the government. They also get the news from the social media. And there's also many different various opinions being presented. So they have the information, also they have the information from overseas. But if we talk about the coronavirus, I think that actually the social media and the information they got is actually to some extent also reinforce people that, some of the behaviors so important, like the wearing mask and following the instructions, stay at home, This kind of information, it's not only just coming from the government. It's also coming from the media, especially from the social media. So it's also, helping to creating such kind of environment is that in China, if you are not wearing a face mask, for example, you consider this is kind of like a guilty. So that is a very special social discourse. So we can say that in each country that the domestic narrative actually played quite an important role. And people knowing, it's giving people a very strong, suggestion about what kind of behavior is good behavior.
When you and I first met, I had done some traveling and I had had experiences out in my life. But when I encountered you, we had this very interesting bond because I had still been seeing everything from a Western set of eyes. And when you and I encountered one another, we were looking at the same thing. We're living just outside of New York City, but you came to it from the Chinese perspective of a person that's been living in the United States, I think, by 10 years by the time you and I had met.
Yeah.
One of the questions that you asked very early in our friendship, our teacher-student relationship was, what do you think that the Chinese want? And I have used this question many, many, many times with people. If I've been out in Iowa or in the mountains, I've met people and they start talking about China and I say, what is it that you think the Chinese want? When you have asked that question over the years, what do you hear Americans say, and how is that different from what you think the Chinese people want?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because I'm currently working on a new book. And the initial title of the book is Make China Great Again. So it's like the same slogan. I actually published the article to compare the President Donald Trump's Make America Great Again and the Chinese president's slogan of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
That's their slogan right now?
Yeah. It's even earlier than Make America Great Again. Yeah. So it's very similar. So to some extent, I think if you ask me what Chinese want, it's similar like people here. It's like what American people want. They want their country to be good, to be wealthy, to be strong. They want to have a good life, good education, good health system. It's the same. But you probably remember that I published a book that during the time you were at Seton. The book is Never Forget National Humiliation. Yes,
it's right on my bookshelf. It's always
yeah. So what this book telling people is basically I made the argument. I said that if you're trying to understand Chinese people, you need to understand their historic memory. And historical memory is kind of like the secret key to open the inner world of the Chinese people. And one particular national experience, we know that national experience played a very important role for each country. And, their worldview, how do they understand their relationship with the world, and also maybe played also a fundamental role for people answering the question, what we want. So for the Chinese people, I argued in that book is that they got a very special national experience that was from Opium War in 1840 until the end of World War II, the end of the war, China with Japan, 1945. During this 100 years, China suffered a lot of foreign invasions, and they consider this 100 years is kind of like, they call it national humiliation.
Americans have no idea about this. And I remember that you and I were writing articles at the time because the Beijing Olympics were going on.
Yeah, exactly.
And we were watching the torch move throughout the United States, and you would see people come out to protest Chinese human rights, Americans, and then you'd see Chinese college students show up and be counter protesters that were pro-Chinese, which to an American was like smashing us against the wall, because the Americans thought, hey, look, we're trying to help you. We're trying to make sure you have human rights. Why are you trying to protect the torch and celebrate China when we all know that it's this dark place, according to the Americans?
Yeah, so that's also like when we talk about like both of us, our work is trying to help the people to be better understood and to improve understanding. I think one of the major misunderstandings very often people have with each other is that we get used to understand another country from our own national experience, from our own institutional experience, from our own cultural framework. So when people trying to understand China, because historical memory, like you mentioned, and I totally agree, that it doesn't play very important role for American identity. People here is more kind of like looking forward rather than looking backward. So it's a little bit difficult for people here to understand China and understand Chinese by using the framework of historic memory. But like I wrote an article, I said the title of the article is "In China, History is like a Religion." So history plays some role as religion because, one of the major difference between China and the U.S., like we talked before, is the majority people here in the U.S., they believe in God or they have a religion beliefs. And the majority of Chinese people, they don't have any religion beliefs. So that makes difference. They have different worldview. They say things differently. And in China, because there's no like strong religion beliefs among the people, so history sometimes played the role as kind of a religion. And the historic memory, especially about this trauma, just like anybody, if for any people, like one of my friend told me that for him, a car accident is such a trauma for him, played such important role to influence that his life after the accident. And for the Chinese people, this century of humiliation, this special national experience is also like the trauma, is like the car accident for my friend. So it's played a so important role to shaping Chinese people. How do they say the outside world?
And Americans, and like I would include myself in on this. The only reason I got outside of my view that I had before was because I met you, and then it made it much easier for me to get outside of it. But I think most of Americans could not describe any of the tragedies that you're talking about happened to the Chinese people. They have no concept of the how the Opium Wars played out. They have no concept of how the Japanese came in and the different war treatments that happened. No idea at all. So these concepts, when they hear about the Chinese having 100 years of national humiliation being a central theme of the childhood's education, in the same way that Washington had his cherry tree and Abraham Lincoln, you guys have that, but we don't understand or know anything at all about that perspective.
Yeah, so that is, one of the major differences of sometimes I think that because this, people, they don't understand each other's the major reference they use. The Chinese so often use history as a reference, but Americans, they don't have this kind of tradition. So that very often causes many of the misunderstandings between them. For example, like, I'm currently working on facilitating a dialogue between the Chinese scholars and American scholars over South China Sea. And I found this very interesting is that very often the dialogue becomes the Chinese people always talking about history. They're talking about based on the old map, based on the history, And American people not really consider history is really an important part of the reference for them to understand the current situation of South China Sea. So they keep talking about for example, the UN Conventional Law of the Sea and those kind of legal documents. So in one of my articles, trying to describe this. This is kind of like a dialogue over the different things. For the Chinese, it's about history. For the Americans, it's about it's kind of a dialogue between historical reality or narrative reality and the legal reality. They are not on the same reality. So it becomes much difficult for them to communicate. Yeah.
How do you bridge that? What do you do in order to make it? I mean, because it's not like all of the Americans are going to take Chinese history lessons and come to the same conclusions. And it's not like the Chinese will say, oh, okay, these documents that are clearly in someone else's favor, we're going to agree to. So how do you get people to come to the table and come to a different decision?
Yeah. First, I think even just get people sitting together, it's a success. They can talk, they can understand each other better. But I have to tell you that for my own experience, it's also a lot of frustration. It's really difficult for them to understand each other. And also, you will find, for example, you have conducted several conferences, and people are just repeating the same kind of narrative. And it's so hard for them to really like we always say that you have to try other people's shoes and you can say from their eyes. And I found it so difficult for the Americans and Chinese to try each other's shoes. They not even like to try. So, and there's also a strong assumptions, I think, on the both sides. Sometimes American participants were assuming you just use history as an excuse. You just trying to...
That's what I feel right now. That's exactly what I feel, yeah.
You're just trying to use an old map for your interest. And the Chinese has a strong belief that Americans just use the law or international UN Convention Law of the Sea, we call it UNCLOS. You just use UNCLOS as excuse because the United States actually not ratify UNCLOS. So the Chinese have strong belief that international law for you is just another tool you use for intervening other country. So they refuse to consider, even to listen to each other's opinion. So that's the major difficulties we have when we're facilitating the dialogue. But I think it's important that we're trying to help them to understand, it's really important to each other. Just like I trying to telling American people that if you disagree Chinese assumption that American just use international law excuse, you should also considering the Chinese are also not just using history as an excuse. They really believe it. And you have to think another way is for any country, we know there's some fundamental texts, like a Bible, like a Constitution, like the Chinese side, they have Confucianism. They have
something that makes you and us, right? Like something that binds you together. Yeah.
Yeah, but besides that, education played a very important role. So one of my arguments, I have keep talking about this for over 10 years, is that I don't think South China Sea can find a solution until the countries involving the dispute, they consider change their domestic textbooks. If they don't change their textbooks, I don't see the possibility for them to reach agreement. Because almost each of the country involved the conflict. If you go to their middle school, high school, if you read their geography book, history textbook, each country, China, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, they're telling their own people. Like the Chinese textbook, I did the research on Chinese textbook and Vietnam textbook. They're telling exact same thing to their people. South China Sea belong to us. And we are the ocean state. We have been using it since the ancient times. And the other countries, they are just invaders. So if we don't change this education, think about the group of people that growing up, after receiving this kind of education, it's difficult for them to change this mentality, to change their understanding. Yeah,
but it
so
is
that,
extremely difficult in the U.S. to change education to be some monolithic thing. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that look at the U.S. system and say, well, our strength is in the fact that you have local control over curriculum. Now, it's not always the way that it plays out, but there's definitely at least 50 curriculums that are different. And anytime a national standard gets put in, everybody's going to fight to the death over what it can and can't say, so it ends up saying almost nothing at all. Whereas in the Chinese system, because it's more centrally managed, it probably doesn't change as often, but when it does, it changes everywhere all at once. Is that right?
Yeah. Actually, you point out a very important is this is also another thing that sometimes causes misunderstanding. Because like you said, in the US, maybe the education textbook not playing that important role in compared with many other countries. Because in the US, like I often ask my students, what your history textbooks telling about this or telling about that event, and I found they using the totally different textbooks. But you have to think it's for the American friends. When you're trying to understand China, you have to think this way. In China, for many decades, not just right now, people are using one single official textbook. So there's all the school in China, except some, very small amount of the private international school, all the school using the same textbook published by the same official publication house. So the textbook is playing much, much more powerful role to shaping people's identity and understanding, especially like subject like history and geography, compared with the US when people are using many different textbooks. And also in many of even we talk about Japan, like I did the research about to compare the Chinese history textbook with Japanese textbooks. We know that Japan is different with China, but still, even in Japan, there's only like 7 or 8 different textbooks being used. It's not like you mentioned in the US, maybe 50 or more than that. So the textbooks play very important role. Yeah.
I think the American perception is that everyone else is susceptible to propaganda, but we don't have it here. And I think in particular, the perception is that the Chinese people themselves either are not allowed to deny the propaganda, but also like kind of embrace it, just kind of see it that it's there and they believe everything. What do the Chinese people think about the way that Americans get information? Do they think we are just as propagandized as we think they are?
They are. I think that actually the Chinese people are very interested in the U.S. So they're knowing a lot of things in the U.S. Like they're very familiar with the NBA, they're very familiar with Hollywood movies. So very often people, including scholars, will say the Chinese people are knowing much more about the U.S. than general Americans knowing about China. But that I often, almost every spring semester, we have a study tour, and we often go to China. And very often, my American students, the first time when they arrive China, they will find it's so different with what they thought before they come in. And also because, for example, before the trip, very often we have the preparation meeting, and I'm telling them that you should know that you are not able to use YouTube. You are not able to use Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp. you weren't able to use all the social media in China. So I think most of students, after they knowing about, they sort of, wow, what kind of country it is. And they even have some kind of concern of personal safety or something, or the special kind of like excitement of visiting a very different country. But after this, they put their foot on China, and they will find it's so different than what they saw. Of course, yes, the people there are not allowed to use this social media I mentioned, but they still have many of their own channels of channels of information. So they know a lot of things about the world, and they are also, they don't have a lot of freedoms to do a lot of things, but they also have a lot of freedoms to do many things they like to do. So the young people there is no big difference compared with young people here. And also, I think many of Chinese people also think that because, people in China, they knowing about the information they get from the official media or the other channels might be wrong. Like you said, might be propaganda. So they're always being mindful. So they're more sensitive to that. So when they hear a news, when they get information, they're trying to not believe it first. But people in the China, sometimes they think that maybe American people, they don't have this level of mindfulness. So they probably also easily being influenced by media, by certain opinion leaders, or by some, narratives, the domestic narratives played such an important role for them because they normally, not questioning about this, like the Chinese young people, they may be more mindful about that. So there's this kind of discussion. I heard a lot about this kind of discussion. Yeah.
It's kind of natural for people to, when they go to a place, they view their people as the good guys, and the new place where they're at first it's novel and exciting, and then it becomes really confusing and kind of isolating when the newness is done and you're tired that you can't speak the language or that people can carry on conversations without you. All these other things are going on. But eventually you can start to come up on the other side and say, okay, I understand where these people are coming from or what they're doing. But in the back of your mind, you kind of always have the narrative of like, my people are the good guys and these are something else. You live in a very weird environment because you grew up in China. You spent part of your professional career there, and then you came to the United States, became a professor, had a family, and you're here. Do you have that switch of good guys and bad guys? Will your children have that same switch of good guys and bad guys, or good team, bad team, my team, the other team? How does that work if you've integrated and moved to another place?
For myself, I don't think I have this identity crisis. And for many years, actually, I think we talked before, I'm kind of quite comfortable of being like you described, that I grew up in another country and moving to a new country, and for now I almost spend the same amount of time in both countries, so I'm familiar with both sides. So I'm quite comfortable my role, whether as an educator, a researcher, to play the role somehow is like a bridge between the two cultures. Or sometimes, like I mentioned to my class, I think I put it in my teaching philosophy statement, is that I consider myself, my job is to some extent as a cultural interpreter. The two countries, they might need, when they communicate, like when I organize my conference on South China Sea, I always trying to get the best interpreter, because that is so important for the scholars from the two countries to
Explain
understand
the
each
difference
other.
between a translator and an interpreter, because most people don't have that subtle knowledge of the difference.
Yeah, so like in the conference, we need the interpreter to help people to understand the other people's what they are saying. So we sometimes do this simultaneous translation. So people sometimes assume that it's the translation is easy, but actually it's not. Especially when we have some cultural concepts.
Yeah, that's the difference between a translator and an interpreter, is that an interpreter is given the power, the social license to say, he's saying these words, but the concept when it gets translated to another culture means this other thing. And there's sometimes when you hire a translator and you say, just say exactly what I'm saying to him.
Yeah.
But in this case, you've got to have somebody with a lot more nuance. There's a lot less interpreters than there are translators.
Yeah. And sometimes I'm telling my participants from both sides, not assuming you're saying anything, and the translator or interpreter can translate 100% to the other side. And you have to think about, you need to, sometimes the speaker yourself need to help the other side to better understand you. And also, when I say cultural interpreter for myself, is that I'm not working, my profession is not, I'm not serving as any kind of translator or interpreter role, but I'm trying to helping the two countries to better understand the other side's, their frame of reference, their mentality, their worldview, their culture, their frames they used. So for many years, I think I'm quite comfortable with this kind of role. I never really say the things like bad guy, good guy. I'm just saying they have the difficulties to understand each other. Maybe I could provide some help to make them easier, to make the things easier for them to understand each other. Because very often misunderstanding caused by miscommunication. But in recent years, like we talked earlier before that I mentioned, I became more and more frustrating, and I found that the understanding becomes more difficult.
And it's becoming more difficult between China and U.S.
Yeah.
Why?
It's a tragedy. It's really a tragedy because. If we think about when U.S. and China established formal diplomatic relations in 1979, it's almost 40 years ago. It's over 40 years ago. So at that time, like my professor in the U.S. university told me that she was the first group the U.S. State Department sent to China. So when she was a Ph.D. student, when she studied China, at that time they have to rely on the newspaper they got from China to understand about China. And the newspaper normally coming 1 week later. So like today, you got the Chinese newspaper 1 week ago. And they learn China this way. But today, the reason I said it's a tragedy is that today we have internet, we have so many channels of communication, but the understanding and communication became so difficult between the two countries. So that's the reason I said it's a tragedy. Yeah.
What do you think is causing the difficulty to understand one another? Is it the fact that there's so much information that it's all noise and we don't know what to pay attention to? Or, I mean, I think there are a lot of Americans that think many of our current problems are because China is pushing these problems into our social media. They're trying to create the divisions that Americans have by over-expressing them. Is this going on both sides? Do both sides perceive that the other one is doing this to them?
Yes, it's true. They blame each other. They consider a lot of bad things is coming from another country. they believe that the other country is taking aggressive behavior, and my side, my country, is just responsive. So this is very interesting. They actually has a quite a very similar, understanding to each other. Is that they can say that the other side is aggressor, and my country, we are just making our responding to the other country's bad, aggressive behavior. And there's many reasons to cause this tragedy. So sometimes, like I said, this is like a Shakespearean tragedy. We all know the reason. We all know something bad to happen, but there's no way for us to stop it. I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings of fundamental reason is probably that each side, they have some major judgment about another country's intention. And to some extent, I can say that both countries is making the biggest strategic mistake for both countries, because they are making some misjudgment about another country's intention. So, for example, many people in the US consider China's national strategy is to replace the United States, to be a dominant power of the world. And many Chinese believe the United States has a master strategy, a master plan to, to overthrow the Chinese government, and to contain China. So both sides have this kind of a major big judgment about another country, but they probably can find each side can find a lot of evidence to support their assumption. But I think it's too early to make this judgment for both of them. And also, it's, you can find evidence, like the American people can find some Chinese indeed to make this kind of argument. And Chinese side can also find some Americans maybe really think that way. But you have to make the difference between whether it's individual or small group of people's opinion, or whether this is commonly accepted by the general public or the majority of people, and it became a national strategy. I think that make big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and that leads back to the question that I was talking about in the beginning, the question where you can ask somebody and they will almost always give you an interesting answer, which is, what do you think the Chinese people want? Because the more news that you read, the more you'll say things, well, they want a new Silk Road so they can cut us out of trade. They are in war with India. They're killing people at the border. The Uyghur problem that's going on, like the Americans believe there's a major human rights conflict there. And they have similar things that they perceive of us doing in the same way?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, I'm organizing the scholar discussions between US and China. So several weeks ago, we had some interesting discussion about what recently happened in the U.S. We know that recently that there's in some cities of the U.S. there's demonstrations, protestings, and about the racial injustice, those kind of things, and these issues, this recent happenings has been widely reported in China. So, for example, like myself, I got a lot of my, friends or people I know, the family members. We are not really, very often regularly in contact, but they're concerned about my safety. So they will write to me and ask me, "Are you okay? Are you safe?" Because for many of the Chinese people, from reading this news, from watching it on the TV, they believe the entire United States now is somehow in revolution. And one of the Chinese participants of my dialogue, he asked the question to the American scholars. He somehow to make the comparison of what happened now in the U.S. with Cultural Revolution in China in 1960s. So he thinks this is very similar.
Oh.
And I know that many people in China is actually consider what happened now in the U.S. is kind of like a Cultural Revolution. So the American scholars disagree, said, no, how can you compare with that? This is totally different. But you know that just like going back when we talk about wearing face mask, we mentioned about the importance of reference. So for the Chinese people, they make the reference with Cultural Revolution. For them, it's much easier to understand. And a lot of American people, when they think about today's China, they make reference with Soviet Union. But you have to know China and today's China with Soviet Union in 1960s, 1970s is totally different.
So tell me about that. When you say it's totally different, what do you mean?
So for example, at that time, the Soviet Union is highly ideological. They have a strong ideology. Today, many people, they probably assume China also has Chinese people or Chinese society is also highly ideologically. Or there's a communist socialism ideology. I think that is one of the major misunderstandings between the two sides. And if you visit China, I think many of my students, they noticed that the market economy and how the people focus, most of the people, they focus not really about ideology issues, but really about how to make money, how to have a better life. It's no difference with people here.
You know, that is fascinating because I've been reading a lot about the Soviet Union and how it came about, and your assessment about that, where the people became ideologically possessed by saying we want equality and we want to take the people that have too much and take it away from them and give it to other people. But what you're saying is the new China, or the China that exists today, those people aren't sitting there talking about equality all the time. They're instead saying, how can I get my family ahead? How can we make business decisions? So what happened in between the 1960s to today that made it so, because the concept of the free market does not appear to be a natural one. It seems to be one that must be cultivated.
Yeah, it's actually after many people, when they discussing about today's China, they very often they forgot about what China has experienced during these 40 years or during the recent 3 or 4 decades. So for example, I often ask my students this question: do you know the per capita GDP for China in 1989? Can you guess? I can tell you today's per capita GDP of China is 10,000 US dollars.
So what was it, 5,000?
It's 304.
Wow.
Yeah. So that, I think when you make this reference, you understand better about China's national experience. In 1989, per capita GDP for Chinese is 304. China is one of the poorest countries in the world. I remember when I was an overseas student in England in my master program, my professor asked me a question about China's per capita GDP. He didn't know about that. And I was not willing to telling him because it's too low. I think it's quite, so I said, I don't remember. But from 1989, from 304 to 10,000, it's
staggering. It's not even one that a regular person could understand. I mean, that'd be like taking a Kenyan villager and giving them an apartment building to be living in and running water and electricity, and It's huge.
Yeah, so you have to think about these two numbers when you think about China. This is the real China that, the recent 30 years, the country is actually focused mainly on economic development. They focus on commerce, they focus on economy, they focus on making their life better. Like my students, the most exciting thing for them is to visiting the in the evening, to visit the market, the night market in the evening, and say so many people are shopping, are selling something, are doing business. So the lively, life of the people, local people there. So until now, China is a country that, like I said, is a focus on economic development. Of course, if you pay attention, only the official newspapers, the official media, or some of the narratives, the reports from from some of the international media, people maybe believe that people there, because it's still communist party, it's still the socialism, Marxism ideology is still the official ideology. But the reality is quite different. Of course, the current administration is more ideological compared with the former administration 5 years ago or 7 years ago. It's true. But there's a major difference, like compared with today's China with Soviet Union. Yeah, even in compared with the economic development, what's the ordinary people, the general public, what they're doing, what's their focus, what's their life, their daily life looks like, you can say there's a major difference. Yeah.
So when you think about the two powers believing that the other side is, not playing by the rules, and you've referred to it as a Shakespearean tragedy, where do we go from here? Is this something that unfolds and the two countries actually fight each other? Does this mean that we have some sort of more economic fallout? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's the reason I use the term Shakespearean tragedy. Is that I'm not really, saying, very. I probably pessimistic, but I think many people in the field also like me. It's when we say it's a Shakespeare tragedy, is that we know something bad going to happen, but there's no way to stop it. It's both sides being motivated. Manipulated is the wrong word. Motivated by nationalism, populism, by some extreme ideas. And both sides has the same type of top leader, ambitions and trying to, just like we talked about their slogan.
Wait. You're saying like, this will be shocking. So you're saying there are parallels between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarity. Yeah, there are a lot of similarity.
This would be something completely not understood by other people. Like, this is a shocking statement to me.
I didn't expect you saying it this way. Yeah, but they have a lot of similarities. Just like we said that they have the very similar slogans, and also I think that the many things between these two countries. So I think some of the scholars of international relations already made the statement saying that many of today's problems between the two countries are actually caused by the two leaders. So if it's a different president, things might be different. So, but of course, we cannot just blame this specific leader for each society. They have the reason coming out. They have the reason became the president. They have their domestic logic, reasons for that.
Well, we used to talk a lot about Putnam's two-level games, where if you want to be a president, whether it's President Xi or President Trump, you have to get the domestic board to agree with you. So you're playing a chess game there. But every piece you move on the domestic board moves a piece on the international board. And you begin to forget that those people have to do things to play on both boards at the same time. So if you're watching them play them, it seems like completely bizarre behaviors, but it makes sense. But to me, the Chinese president is nearly silent. I never see him in a place where he's speaking. I never watch his speeches translated. To me, he's almost mute.
Okay. So that's also the reason I think very often we have the misunderstanding about another country is that we hear more about our own leaders, their activities, their speech, their point of views. And actually the Chinese leader is actually he made a lot of comments, a lot of he changed China. Both institutionally and also in terms of the policy. So he made a lot of difference. So, the leaders, they play quite important role in any society, any types of the government, their personal preference, especially their personal ambitions, sometimes it's also a tragedy when you got the leaders, especially the major powers, and you got the two leaders happen to be the same time. Both of them has a very strong personal agenda or very strong ambitions. And then the clash of ambitions becomes difficult to avoid.
The Clash of Ambitions. I think that's a very good title. Well, it's very interesting to call you Dr. Wang. We've been so close for so long. This has been great for us to start this up. I would like to have you on more frequently. I think there's always going to be news between these two cultures, and it took us a little while to get this started. But now that we've had you on, I'd love to have you on more to talk about this and negotiations and what else is going on in the world.
You're welcome, and I'm happy to talk just like we talked. When you were at Seton House, so we have a lot of dialogue about the two countries, and we are helping each other to understand better about another country.
Yeah, so, and you had mentioned something about we thought that the internet was going to make it much easier for, if we're going to go to war with Saudi Arabia or Iraq or China, that we would be able to get on the phone and talk with people from there, but it doesn't happen. So conversations like this, I think, are the first step towards making those kinds of things happen.
Yeah, it's true. And also because the internet, emerge of the internet and social media, people, at the social media, you notice that people normally follow someone, they have similar opinion or similar interest like you. So that makes people, your source of information became very selective. So people with the same opinions, they actually reinforce each other. And they don't have the opportunity to take the alternative opinions. So that's also the important reason that we need to do dialogue more often. Yeah.
Well, you'll love this. I started a network from people that listen to this podcast, and basically it's to come in and people can practice their communication skills. So if they want to practice for a job interview, or they want to put up a speech. But the craziest thing that's happened is that none of these people came knowing each other, so their opinions are all different. And so you see these people having conversations about topics that you're like, oh, I never thought about that. And it's just that they come from slightly different orientations, and it makes a big difference in the ideas that you come across.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's always interesting when you speak with people, they have different background. Yeah.
So if people wanted to get a hold of you, if they wanted to hear more about your China work or read some of your books, what's the best way to look you up?
Actually, I don't use much, a lot of social media, but I think the best way is that to send my publications, and I hope this book will coming out soon. But yeah.
As soon as your book is published, we'll do another interview again. That'll be great.
Sure.
All right. It was good to see you.
Yeah, great. Thank you.